In the shadows of history lies Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp, which would become a symbol of both unspeakable horror and the resilience of the human spirit. Established in 1933, Dachau was the prototype for the vast network of camps that spread across Europe, sites where millions of innocent people were subjected to unimaginable cruelty. This documentary takes you deep into the heart of Dachau's dark legacy, unraveling the stories of those who wielded power with ruthless efficiency and those who suffered under their tyranny. Through vivid accounts and harrowing testimonies, we explore the chilling realities of life and death within the camp's walls, as well as the trials that sought to bring justice in the aftermath of such atrocities. Yet, Dachau's story is not merely one of suffering. It is also a story of accountability, justice, and the enduring importance of remembrance. As we journey through the final moments of the war criminals who once ruled with an iron fist and the broader implications of their crimes, we are reminded of the vital lessons that must be learned from this dark chapter of history. The legacy of Dachau serves as both a warning and a call to action, a reminder that we must never forget the past and must continue to fight against the forces of hatred and oppression in our world today. This exploration of Dachau is not just a retelling of historical events. It is a powerful meditation on the human condition and the ongoing struggle for justice and human dignity. Chapter 1: Execution of Dachau Guards. The execution of the Dachau Concentration Camp guards marked a significant and solemn chapter in the aftermath of World War II. These men, who once wielded power with merciless cruelty, were now reduced to mere prisoners awaiting their fate. The documentary paints a vivid picture of the trials that led to their executions, detailing the process by which justice was meted out. The trials themselves were an intense, emotional spectacle, as witnesses and survivors recounted the unimaginable horrors they had endured. For many, these executions were not just about retribution. They represented a necessary closure to a dark period in human history. The American forces, tasked with carrying out these sentences, approached the executions with a mix of duty and somber reflection, understanding the historical weight of their actions. This wasn't just the end of a war, it was the end of a nightmare for countless victims who had suffered under the Nazi regime. The guards who faced execution were the embodiment of Nazi brutality. They had overseen some of the most heinous crimes committed during the Holocaust, including the systematic torture and murder of innocent people. Their positions of authority within the concentration camps had given them the power to decide who lived and who died, a power they wielded without mercy. As they awaited execution, many of these men were confronted with the enormity of their crimes for the first time. Stripped of their titles and their authority, they were no longer the feared SS officers but condemned criminals. This stark transformation from powerful tyrants to powerless prisoners is one of the most compelling aspects of the documentary, as it forces the viewer to consider the complexities of justice in the aftermath of such horrific crimes. The executions themselves were carried out with a chilling efficiency that mirrored the cold, calculated cruelty these men had once inflicted upon their victims. The documentary spares no detail in describing the procedures followed during these executions, from the final moments of the condemned to the somber atmosphere that pervaded the execution sites. These were not public spectacles but private, military affairs, conducted with the utmost seriousness. For the American forces involved, this was not a moment of triumph but of grim duty. The executions were a necessary part of the process of justice, a way to ensure that those responsible for the atrocities of Dachau were held accountable. Yet, even as the last of the Dachau guards were executed, the legacy of their crimes would continue to haunt the world, serving as a stark reminder of the capacity for human cruelty and the importance of justice in the face of such evil. This narrative, however, does not end with the execution of the guards. The trials and the justice meted out at Dachau were just a piece of the larger puzzle of post-war justice. The world had only begun to grapple with the full extent of the Holocaust and the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. The Dachau trials, while a crucial step, were just the beginning of a long and painful journey towards understanding and reconciliation. As the story of the Dachau guards comes to a close, the broader implications of the war crimes trials begin to unfold, leading us to the next chapter in this grim history. Chapter 2: War Crimes Trials. The Dachau trials were a watershed moment in the pursuit of justice after World War II, representing not only a legal reckoning but also a moral one. These trials, held in the immediate aftermath of the war, were among the first to bring Nazi war criminals to account for their atrocities. Unlike other trials, such as those held in Nuremberg, the Dachau trials focused specifically on crimes committed within the concentration camps, making them a deeply personal and emotional process for the survivors who testified. The gravity of the charges, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and violations of the laws of war, underscored the importance of these proceedings in the broader context of post-war justice. The trial process was meticulous and methodical, ensuring that the evidence against the accused was irrefutable. The prosecution presented a staggering array of documents, photographs, and eyewitness testimonies that painted a harrowing picture of life in the Dachau concentration camp. These materials were not just damning, they were undeniable. The survivors who took the stand provided some of the most compelling evidence, recounting in excruciating detail the daily horrors they had endured. Their testimonies were filled with stories of unimaginable cruelty, random beatings, starvation, forced labor, and the constant threat of execution. The courtroom became a somber theater where the darkest aspects of human nature were laid bare, and the audience, including the world at large, was forced to confront the full scope of the Nazi regime's brutality. The defendants, many of whom were high-ranking SS officers and camp personnel, appeared cold and detached, often denying their involvement or downplaying their roles in the atrocities. However, the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution made it impossible for them to escape justice. The trials were not just about punishing the guilty. They were about affirming the rule of law and the principles of human rights that had been so egregiously violated. The legal teams involved in the Dachau trials worked tirelessly to ensure that the proceedings were fair and impartial, despite the enormity of the crimes and the emotions surrounding them. This commitment to justice, even in the face of such horror, was a testament to the resilience of the legal system and the importance of upholding the principles of due process, even for those who had shown no mercy to their victims. The sentences handed down were severe, reflecting the gravity of the crimes committed. Of the 40 German guards tried at Dachau, 28 were sentenced to death, a clear indication of the court's determination to hold these individuals accountable. The executions that followed were carried out with a somber sense of duty, recognizing that while these acts could never undo the suffering inflicted, they were a necessary step in the process of justice. For the survivors and the families of the victims, these sentences provided a measure of closure, though the scars of their experiences would remain with them forever. The Dachau trials set a precedent for how the world would deal with war crimes, establishing principles that would influence subsequent trials and the development of international human rights law. Beyond the individual cases, the Dachau trials served as a crucial educational moment for the world. The detailed documentation of the crimes committed within the camp provided an irrefutable record of the Holocaust's horrors, ensuring that future generations would not forget. The trials also highlighted the importance of international cooperation in the pursuit of justice, as legal teams from different Allied nations worked together to prosecute the Nazi war criminals. This collaboration laid the groundwork for the development of international institutions, such as the International Criminal Court, which continue to play a vital role in addressing crimes against humanity. The Dachau trials were a powerful reminder that the pursuit of justice does not end with the end of conflict. It is an ongoing process that requires vigilance, dedication, and a commitment to the principles of human dignity and the rule of law. The impact of the Dachau trials extended far beyond the courtroom. They were a crucial step in the global recognition of the Holocaust and the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. The trials brought the horrors of the concentration camps into the public consciousness, forcing the world to reckon with the full extent of the genocide. They also served as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of holding those in authority accountable for their actions. The legacy of the Dachau trials can be seen in the continued efforts to bring war criminals to justice, even decades after the events in question. These trials set a standard for accountability that has influenced subsequent efforts to address war crimes and human rights violations around the world. The Dachau trials also had a profound impact on the survivors who testified. For many, the trials provided an opportunity to tell their stories and ensure that the truth of what happened in the camps would not be forgotten. The act of testifying was both painful and cathartic, as it allowed survivors to confront their tormentors and seek justice for themselves and their fellow prisoners. The bravery and resilience of these survivors were instrumental in ensuring that the trials had the impact they did, as their testimonies brought the realities of the Holocaust into stark relief. The Dachau trials were not just a legal process. They were a critical part of the healing and recovery process for the survivors and the world as a whole. In the end, the Dachau trials were a necessary and important step in the pursuit of justice for the victims of the Holocaust. They represented a moment of reckoning for those who had perpetrated some of the worst crimes in human history and served as a powerful reminder of the importance of accountability. The lessons learned from these trials continue to resonate today, as the world grapples with ongoing issues of war crimes, human rights violations, and the need for justice. The Dachau trials were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring importance of the rule of law, even in the face of unimaginable evil. As the world moves forward, the legacy of these trials serves as a guide for how to confront and address the darkest chapters of human history. Chapter 3: Life and Crimes of Martin Gottfried Weiss. Martin Gottfried Weiss was not just another cog in the Nazi machine. He was a key figure in the administration of terror at the Dachau Concentration Camp. As the commandant, Weiss wielded absolute power within the camp's walls, overseeing the daily operations and ensuring that the brutal regime of forced labor, torture, and execution was carried out with ruthless efficiency. His tenure at Dachau was marked by a profound cruelty that left an indelible scar on the camp's history. Under his command, Dachau became not just a place of imprisonment but a factory of death, where human lives were systematically destroyed under the guise of military necessity. The documentary delves deep into Weiss's life, exploring the motivations and decisions that led him to become one of the most feared figures in the Nazi hierarchy. Weiss's rise to power within the SS was emblematic of the broader culture of brutality that defined the Nazi regime. He was not born into a life of privilege or power. Rather, he climbed the ranks through a combination of ideological commitment and a willingness to enact the most brutal policies with little regard for human life. His leadership at Dachau was characterized by an obsessive attention to detail, particularly in the execution of punishments and the enforcement of the camp's strict, often arbitrary rules. Under Weiss, the camp became a testing ground for new methods of oppression, including the infamous standing cells, where prisoners were forced to stand for days on end in tiny, cramped spaces, and the introduction of brutal forced labor regimes that led to the deaths of thousands. Weiss was also directly involved in the selection process for executions, personally deciding which prisoners would live and which would die. One of the most heinous aspects of Weiss's command was his involvement in the medical experiments conducted at Dachau, particularly those led by Dr. Klaus Schilling, who conducted malaria experiments on prisoners. Weiss not only sanctioned these experiments but also ensured that they were carried out with maximum efficiency, providing the necessary resources and manpower to conduct them on a large scale. These experiments were nothing short of torture, as prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria and subjected to various treatments to test their effects. The suffering endured by these prisoners was immense, and many did not survive. Those who did were often left with permanent physical and psychological scars. Weiss's complicity in these experiments highlights the depths of his cruelty and his complete disregard for human life. Weiss's administration extended beyond Dachau to other concentration camps, most notably Nungam, where he played a pivotal role in the camp's construction and operation. Nungam was notorious for its brutal forced labor conditions, which Weiss helped to implement and enforce. The camp was primarily used as a site for producing bricks for Nazi construction projects, and prisoners were subjected to grueling labor under inhumane conditions. The death toll at Nungam was staggering, with tens of thousands of prisoners perishing due to the harsh conditions, starvation, and disease. Weiss's involvement in the establishment and operation of Nungam further cemented his reputation as one of the most ruthless figures in the Nazi regime, responsible for the deaths of countless innocent people. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his crimes, Weiss remained unrepentant throughout his trial, refusing to acknowledge the suffering he had caused. His defense, like many others, was rooted in the claim that he was simply following orders, a common refrain among Nazi war criminals. However, the evidence presented at his trial made it clear that Weiss was not merely a passive participant in the atrocities but an active and enthusiastic perpetrator. His meticulous records and personal involvement in the camp's operations left little doubt about his guilt. The trial revealed the extent of his cruelty, not just as a commander but as a man who had fully embraced the ideology of hate that fueled the Nazi regime. Weiss's execution was seen by many as a just end for a man who had caused so much pain and suffering. However, his legacy lives on as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the capacity for evil within ordinary individuals. The story of Martin Gottfried Weiss is not just a tale of one man's descent into darkness but a reflection of the broader horrors of the Holocaust and the need for vigilance in preventing such atrocities from happening again. The documentary's portrayal of Weiss is both chilling and necessary, providing a detailed account of his crimes and the justice that was ultimately served. As the narrative of Martin Gottfried Weiss draws to a close, the focus shifts to the broader picture of commandant brutality across the concentration camps, illustrating that Weiss was not an anomaly but part of a much larger, more terrifying pattern of systematic cruelty. Chapter 4: Cruelty of Other Commandants. The brutality exhibited by Martin Gottfried Weiss was not unique. It was part of a much larger pattern of cruelty that permeated the ranks of Nazi commandants and SS officers throughout the concentration camp system. The documentary shifts its focus to other key figures in this horrific hierarchy, shedding light on the widespread and systematic nature of the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. These commandants, much like Weiss, were not merely following orders. They were often enthusiastic participants in the brutality, driven by a mix of ideological fervor and a deep-seated sense of power. Their actions, fueled by a toxic combination of authority and hatred, turned the camps into living nightmares for those imprisoned within their walls. One of the most notorious commandants highlighted in the documentary is Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, whose name has become synonymous with the Holocaust's horrors. Under Höss's leadership, Auschwitz became the largest and most infamous of the Nazi death camps, where over 1 million people were systematically murdered. Höss's approach to his role was marked by a chilling detachment and a relentless drive to increase the efficiency of the camp's killing operations. He oversaw the construction of gas chambers and crematoria designed to exterminate large numbers of people quickly and with minimal effort, turning Auschwitz into a death factory. Höss's cruelty was not limited to the logistical aspects of genocide. He was also known for his brutal treatment of prisoners, enforcing a regime of terror that left little room for hope or survival. Another figure of terror was Amon Goth, the commandant of the Dachau Concentration Camp, whose sadistic tendencies made him one of the most feared figures among the prisoners. Goth's cruelty was infamous, even among his fellow Nazis. He was known to shoot prisoners from his balcony for sport and imposed arbitrary punishments that often led to death. His reign of terror at Dachau was characterized by random acts of violence, public executions, and a complete disregard for human life. The documentary delves into Goth's psyche, exploring how his sadism was not just tolerated but encouraged within the Nazi hierarchy, reflecting the broader culture of dehumanization that defined the SS. Goth's eventual capture and execution were seen as a small measure of justice for the countless lives he destroyed, but the scars of his cruelty remained long after his death. The documentary also explores the actions of Irma Gries, known as the Hyena of Auschwitz, whose role as a guard at several concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, made her one of the most notorious female war criminals of the era. Gries was notorious for her sadistic behavior towards prisoners, including physical and psychological torture. She was often seen with a whip and a pistol, both of which she used with deadly precision. Her youth, she was only in her early 20s, made her cruelty even more shocking. The documentary examines how someone so young could become so deeply involved in the machinery of death, offering insights into the broader social and ideological indoctrination that enabled such horrors. Gries' trial and execution highlighted the role of women in the Nazi regime's atrocities, challenging the perception that cruelty was solely the domain of male commandants and officers. Each of these commandants played a crucial role in the Nazi regime's systematic destruction of human life. Their actions were not the result of momentary lapses in judgment but were part of a deliberate, calculated effort to implement the final solution. The documentary underscores the importance of understanding these individuals not just as isolated monsters, but as part of a broader system that encouraged and rewarded such behavior. The cruelty of these commandants was a reflection of the Nazi regime's core values: racism, anti-Semitism, and a belief in the superiority of the Aryan race, which were used to justify the most heinous crimes in human history. The legacy of these commandants is one of unimaginable cruelty, but it also serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the potential for evil that exists within all societies. The documentary emphasizes the need for vigilance in the face of such threats, highlighting the importance of education and remembrance in preventing history from repeating itself. As the narrative of these brutal commandants concludes, the focus turns to the final moments of these war criminals, offering a glimpse into the end of a dark chapter in history. Chapter 5. Final Moments. The final moments of the Nazi war criminals who were tried and sentenced to death at Dachau were as somber as they were significant. The documentary provides a detailed account of these last hours, offering viewers a rare glimpse into the psychological and emotional state of men who once wielded unimaginable power but were now facing the ultimate retribution for their crimes. The execution chamber, stark and unembellished, became the stage where justice was finally delivered. These moments were not just about the act of execution. They were a symbolic end to the lives of those who had orchestrated some of the most horrific atrocities in human history. As they faced their imminent deaths, many of these men remained defiant, clinging to the ideology that had brought them to power. The documentary recounts how some attempted to maintain their composure, standing tall and refusing to show fear, while others broke down, overcome by the reality of their situation. For the most part, these final moments were characterized by a sense of resignation, as the condemned men realized that there was no escape from the consequences of their actions. The procedures were carried out with military precision, quick, efficient, and final. The hangings were not public spectacles. They were private, controlled events, witnessed only by a select few, including military officials, legal representatives, and a handful of witnesses. This was a deliberate choice, ensuring that the executions were seen as a solemn duty rather than an act of revenge. The documentary explores the psychological impact of these final moments on both the condemned and those tasked with carrying out the sentences. For the executioners, this was a duty that weighed heavily on their shoulders. While they were fulfilling a necessary role in the pursuit of justice, they were also keenly aware of the historical significance of their actions. These men were not just executing criminals. They were closing a chapter on one of the darkest periods in human history. The executioners approached their task with a grim sense of responsibility, understanding that while they were enacting justice, they were also playing a part in a broader process of historical reckoning. The atmosphere in the execution chamber was one of palpable tension, underscored by the knowledge that these acts, though necessary, were the culmination of unimaginable suffering. The final moments of men like Martin Gottfried Weiss and other Dachau commandants were, in many ways, a mirror image of the horrors they had inflicted on their victims. The same efficiency and cold detachment they had shown in administering death within the concentration camps were now turned against them. The documentary emphasizes the stark contrast between their lives as powerful enforcers of the Nazi regime and their deaths as powerless prisoners, stripped of the authority they had once wielded so ruthlessly. This reversal of fortunes serves as a powerful reminder of the inevitability of justice, no matter how long it may take to arrive. Yet, as the documentary closes the chapter on these executions, it also raises important questions about the nature of justice and retribution. Were these executions a true form of justice, or were they simply an act of vengeance? The documentary leaves this question open-ended, inviting viewers to consider the complexities of post-war justice. It is clear, however, that for the survivors and the families of the victims, these executions provided a necessary sense of closure. The death of these war criminals marked the end of a long and painful journey towards justice, a journey that had begun in the concentration camps and ended in the execution chamber. As the narrative of these final moments draws to a close, the documentary shifts its focus to the broader implications of the Dachau trials and the legacy of the Holocaust, setting the stage for a discussion on the role of remembrance and education in preventing such atrocities from occurring again. Chapter 6. Dachau Trials. The Dachau trials stand as a monumental moment in the pursuit of post-war justice, representing one of the earliest efforts to hold Nazi war criminals accountable for their atrocities. These trials were a direct response to the horrors uncovered in the Dachau Concentration Camp and other similar facilities, where countless individuals were subjected to unimaginable cruelty. The significance of these trials cannot be overstated. They were among the first instances where the world witnessed the systematic prosecution of those responsible for the Holocaust. The trials served not only as a means of delivering justice to the victims, but also as a crucial step in the global recognition of the full extent of Nazi war crimes. The Dachau trials were held under the auspices of the U.S. military, with the proceedings taking place within the very walls of the concentration camp where so much suffering had occurred. The choice of location was both symbolic and practical, as it underscored the direct connection between the crimes being prosecuted and the place where they had been committed. Over 40 German guards and officers were tried in this initial wave of prosecutions, with charges ranging from war crimes to crimes against humanity. The defendants included a wide range of individuals, from high-ranking SS officers to lower-level guards, all of whom played a role in the brutal administration of the camp. The evidence presented was overwhelming, including eyewitness testimonies, documentary evidence, and physical artifacts from the camp itself, all of which painted a harrowing picture of the conditions and actions that had led to the deaths of tens of thousands of prisoners. The trials were marked by a strong sense of moral and legal clarity. The prosecutors, many of whom were deeply moved by the testimonies of survivors, were determined to ensure that justice was served. The legal framework for the trials was based on established principles of international law, particularly those related to war crimes and crimes against humanity. These principles had been developed in the aftermath of World War I, but had never been applied on such a scale as they were at Dachau. The trials were not merely about punishing individuals for their crimes. They were about establishing a legal and moral precedent that would resonate for generations to come. The defense often attempted to argue that the accused were simply following orders, a common refrain among Nazi war criminals, but the court firmly rejected this argument, holding that individual responsibility could not be negated by the chain of command. The sentences handed down were severe, reflecting the gravity of the crimes committed. Of the 40 defendants, 28 received death sentences, while the others were given lengthy prison terms. The executions were carried out swiftly, a stark contrast to the years of suffering endured by the victims of Dachau and other camps. These sentences were seen as a necessary step in delivering justice, though they could never fully atone for the lives lost and the suffering inflicted. The Dachau trials set a powerful example for subsequent war crimes trials, including the more widely known Nuremberg trials, and helped to lay the groundwork for the development of modern international human rights law. The impact of the Dachau trials extended far beyond the courtroom. They played a crucial role in shaping the post-war narrative about the Holocaust and the Nazi regime's crimes. The detailed records and testimonies from the trials provided an invaluable resource for historians, educators, and legal scholars, ensuring that the atrocities of the Holocaust would not be forgotten. The trials also served as a powerful reminder of the importance of accountability in the face of such unimaginable evil. They underscored the idea that justice, while often delayed, must eventually be served, and that those who commit atrocities will be held accountable, regardless of their position or rank. As the Dachau trials concluded, they left behind a legacy of justice that continues to influence international law and human rights to this day. The principles established during these trials have been invoked in subsequent efforts to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity, from the tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda to the ongoing work of the International Criminal Court. The Dachau trials were not just a response to the horrors of the past. They were a foundational moment in the ongoing struggle to uphold human dignity and the rule of law in the face of the most heinous crimes. The conclusion of the Dachau trials marked the end of a significant chapter in the pursuit of justice for Holocaust victims, but it also signaled the beginning of a broader movement to ensure that such crimes would never be repeated. As the narrative of these trials draws to a close, the focus shifts to the broader role of Dachau as a prototype for other concentration camps and the enduring legacy of the Holocaust in shaping global consciousness. Chapter 7: Role of Dachau. Dachau holds a unique and chilling place in the history of the Holocaust, serving as the first concentration camp established by the Nazi regime and a model for the network of camps that would follow. Opened in 1933, just weeks after Adolf Hitler came to power, Dachau was originally intended to house political prisoners, primarily communists and socialists who opposed the Nazi government. However, as the regime's policies of persecution expanded, so too did the camp's purpose. Dachau quickly evolved into a training ground for SS guards and a prototype for the brutal system of concentration camps that would spread across Europe. The camp's structure, operations, and methods of prisoner control were replicated in other camps, making Dachau a critical part of the Nazi regime's machinery of terror. The documentary delves into the operational details of Dachau, highlighting how the camp's layout and procedures became a blueprint for other camps. Dachau was meticulously designed to dehumanize and control its prisoners, with barracks constructed to hold far more people than they could reasonably accommodate, and a strict regimen of forced labor, starvation, and brutality enforced by the guards. The SS officers who trained at Dachau would go on to implement these same techniques in other camps, spreading the culture of cruelty and oppression that defined the Nazi concentration camp system. Dachau was not just a place of imprisonment. It was an experimental lab where the methods of mass incarceration, forced labor, and systematic murder were perfected. Over its 12 years of operation, Dachau became a symbol of Nazi brutality, with over 188,000 prisoners passing through its gates. These prisoners came from all walks of life: political dissidents, Jews, Romani people, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The conditions within the camp were horrific, with overcrowding, disease, and malnutrition rampant among the prisoners. The camp also served as the site for a series of brutal medical experiments, many of which resulted in the death or permanent injury of the subjects. These experiments, sanctioned by the Nazi leadership, were a gruesome extension of the regime's ideology, treating human beings as mere objects to be used and discarded in the pursuit of pseudo-scientific knowledge. The documentary also explores the role Dachau played in the wider context of the Holocaust. As a prototype for other concentration camps, Dachau's influence was profound, shaping the operation of camps like Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen. The methods of control, punishment, and execution developed at Dachau were exported to these other camps, contributing to the systematized genocide that would claim millions of lives. The camp's role as a training center for SS guards meant that it was directly responsible for spreading the techniques of terror across the Nazi-occupied territories. Dachau was not just a site of suffering. It was a hub of Nazi ideology, where the principles of racial purity, anti-Semitism, and totalitarian control were put into practice with devastating effect. The liberation of Dachau by American forces in April 1945 was a moment of profound historical significance. The soldiers who entered the camp were confronted with scenes of unimaginable horror: piles of bodies, emaciated prisoners, and the remnants of the camp's operations. The liberation of Dachau was a powerful symbol of the defeat of the Nazi regime, but it also served as a stark reminder of the horrors that had been inflicted on millions of people. The documentary captures the emotional impact of this moment, not just for the soldiers who liberated the camp, but for the world as a whole. The images and reports from Dachau became some of the first concrete evidence of the Holocaust to reach the wider public, shocking the world and galvanizing efforts to bring those responsible to justice. Dachau's legacy is one of both horror and resilience. While it stands as a reminder of the depths of human cruelty, it is also a testament to the strength and endurance of those who survived. The camp's history continues to serve as a crucial educational tool, reminding future generations of the dangers of unchecked power, intolerance, and hatred. The documentary underscores the importance of preserving this history, not just as a memorial to the victims, but as a warning to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. As the narrative of Dachau's role concludes, the focus shifts to the construction and operation of other camps, like Nungam, where the same brutal methods were employed with equally devastating results. Chapter 8: Construction of Nungam. The construction and operation of the Nungam concentration camp were directly influenced by the brutal systems developed at Dachau. Located near Hamburg, Nungam began as a sub-camp of Sachsenhausen in 1938, but it quickly expanded into a large, independent concentration camp as part of the Nazi regime's broader strategy of forced labor and systematic extermination. The camp's establishment was overseen by men like Martin Gottfried Weiss, whose experience at Dachau equipped him with the knowledge and ruthlessness needed to implement the Nazi vision at Nungam. The camp became a site of unimaginable suffering, where the principles of terror and dehumanization that had been perfected at Dachau were carried out with relentless efficiency. Nungam was primarily built to serve the Nazi war machine, with prisoners forced to work in brutal conditions to produce bricks, build infrastructure, and manufacture goods for the military. The construction of the camp itself was carried out by the prisoners, who were subjected to grueling labor, inadequate food, and constant abuse from the SS guards. The camp's location, near a clay pit and brickworks, made it ideal for the production of materials needed for Hitler's ambitious construction projects, including the rebuilding of Berlin. However, the cost of this production was paid in human lives. The work was backbreaking, and the conditions were so harsh that thousands of prisoners died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and mistreatment. The camp's expansion was driven by the increasing demand for forced labor as the war progressed. Nungam became one of the central hubs in the Nazi system of exploitation, with its population swelling to over 100,000 prisoners by the war's end. These prisoners were drawn from across Europe: Jews, political dissidents, resistance fighters, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. As in other camps, the prisoners at Nungam were subjected to constant violence and degradation. The SS guards, many of whom had been trained at Dachau, enforced a regime of terror that left little room for hope or survival. The documentary provides harrowing accounts of life in the camp, including testimonies from survivors who described the relentless brutality of the guards and the sheer impossibility of the work they were forced to do. One of the most notorious aspects of Nungam was the medical experimentation carried out on prisoners. Much like the experiments at Dachau, these were conducted with complete disregard for human life. Prisoners were subjected to horrific procedures, including the testing of vaccines and drugs under extreme conditions, often leading to death or permanent injury. These experiments were justified by the Nazi regime as necessary for the war effort, but in reality, they were little more than torture disguised as science. The documentary highlights the role of SS doctors and medical personnel in these atrocities, drawing a direct line from the ideology of racial purity to the inhumane treatment of those deemed unworthy by the Nazis. Nungam also became a site of mass murder towards the end of the war. As the Allied forces advanced, the SS began to systematically exterminate prisoners to prevent them from being liberated and testifying about the horrors they had witnessed. Thousands of prisoners were killed in the camp's final days, either through direct execution or by being forced on death marches that few survived. The destruction of evidence, including the burning of records and the dismantling of facilities, was part of a broader effort by the Nazis to cover up their crimes as the war drew to a close. However, the sheer scale of the atrocities committed at Nungam, coupled with the testimony of survivors, ensured that the camp's history would not be erased. The legacy of Nungam is one of profound suffering, but it is also a testament to the resilience of those who survived. The camp, like Dachau, serves as a powerful reminder of the capacity for human cruelty when unchecked by moral and legal constraints. The documentary emphasizes the importance of remembering Nungam, not just as a site of tragedy, but as a critical piece of the larger history of the Holocaust. The lessons learned from Nungam, like those from other concentration camps, continue to inform contemporary discussions about human rights, justice, and the need for vigilance in the face of oppression. As the narrative of Nungam's construction and operation draws to a close, the focus shifts to the specific acts of brutality carried out by the SS guards and commandants who were trained at Dachau, further illustrating the pervasive culture of cruelty that defined the Nazi concentration camp system. Chapter 9: SS Brutality. The brutality of the SS guards and commandants who were trained at Dachau was not confined to a single camp but spread like a contagion throughout the entire Nazi concentration camp system. These individuals were indoctrinated with a perverse ideology that justified and even encouraged the most inhumane treatment of prisoners. The documentary delves into the widespread nature of SS brutality, highlighting how the methods of terror and control developed at Dachau became standard practice in camps across Europe. This chapter explores the systematic cruelty that was not only tolerated but institutionalized within the ranks of the SS, turning ordinary men and women into perpetrators of unimaginable atrocities. The SS guards were trained to view prisoners not as human beings but as subhuman enemies of the state, deserving of no mercy or compassion. This dehumanization was a core component of the SS training programs, which emphasized absolute obedience to orders and the suppression of any moral qualms about the treatment of prisoners. The guards were taught to enforce discipline through fear and violence, using beatings, torture, and executions as tools to maintain order. The documentary provides chilling accounts from survivors who witnessed or experienced the daily acts of brutality inflicted by the SS. These acts were not random. They were deliberate, calculated measures designed to break the spirit of the prisoners and reinforce the absolute power of the SS over their lives. One of the most notorious examples of SS brutality was the punishment system, which was designed to instill constant fear in the prisoners. Minor infractions, such as speaking out of turn or failing to work fast enough, could result in severe beatings, solitary confinement, or even execution. The documentary recounts how the SS guards used a variety of torture methods, from flogging and hanging prisoners by their arms behind their backs to forcing them to stand in stress positions for hours or days. These punishments were often carried out in public, serving as a grim reminder to others of the consequences of disobedience. The documentary emphasizes that this culture of violence was not an aberration but a fundamental aspect of the Nazi regime's approach to controlling its prisoner population. The SS also employed psychological torture as a means of control. Guards would frequently humiliate prisoners, stripping them of their dignity through acts such as forced nudity, verbal abuse, and degrading work assignments. This psychological warfare was designed to erode the prisoner's sense of self-worth and to create an atmosphere of hopelessness within the camps. The documentary highlights how this constant psychological pressure, combined with the physical brutality, led to a profound sense of despair among the prisoners. Many were driven to the brink of madness, unable to cope with the relentless abuse and the knowledge that death could come at any moment. The SS ability to inflict such suffering with apparent detachment and even satisfaction speaks to the depths of the dehumanization process that took place within the ranks of the Nazi regime. The brutality of the SS was not limited to physical and psychological torture. It also extended to the systematic extermination of prisoners. The documentary explores the role of the SS in the mass executions that took place across the concentration camps. These executions were often carried out with cold efficiency, using methods such as shooting, hanging, and, most infamously, gas chambers. The SS guards and officers involved in these killings were often the same individuals who had been trained at Dachau, where they learned the techniques of mass murder that would later be employed on an industrial scale at camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka. The documentary underscores the tragic irony that the very men and women tasked with enforcing the Nazi regime's ideology of racial purity and superiority were themselves corrupted and degraded by the acts they committed. As the war drew to a close and the full extent of the Holocaust was revealed, the SS brutality became one of the central focuses of the war crimes trials. The documentary details how the atrocities committed by the SS were meticulously documented and presented as evidence in trials like those at Dachau and Nuremberg. The testimonies of survivors and the physical evidence left behind in the camps provided incontrovertible proof of the SS crimes. These trials not only held the perpetrators accountable, but also served as a public reckoning with the horrors of the Holocaust. The SS brutality was laid bare for the world to see, and the sentences handed down to the guilty were seen as a necessary measure of justice for the victims. However, the documentary also raises important questions about the nature of justice in the face of such overwhelming evil. Can any punishment truly atone for the suffering inflicted by the SS? What responsibility does society have to remember and learn from these atrocities? These questions linger as the documentary transitions to the final chapter, which explores the post-war executions of SS officers and the continuing impact of their crimes on our understanding of human rights and justice. Chapter 10. Post-war executions. The post-war executions of SS officers and other Nazi war criminals marked a crucial, yet somber, conclusion to the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. As the world grappled with the enormity of the crimes uncovered in the concentration camps, the demand for justice became overwhelming. The executions that followed the Dachau trials, along with other war crimes trials, were seen as a necessary response to the unspeakable horrors that had been inflicted upon millions. These executions were not just about retribution. They were about ensuring that those responsible for the most heinous acts in human history were held accountable in a way that resonated with both the survivors and the broader international community. The documentary provides a detailed account of how these executions were carried out, focusing on the individuals who were sentenced to death for their roles in the Nazi regime's machinery of death. Many of these men, including high-ranking SS officers like Martin Gottfried Weiss, faced the gallows with little to no remorse for their actions. Their trials had revealed the depth of their involvement in the systematic extermination and brutalization of prisoners, leaving no doubt about their guilt. The executions themselves were conducted with military precision, often in the very camps where these men had once exercised absolute power. The irony of their final moments, standing in the same places where they had ordered the deaths of so many others, was not lost on those who witnessed these events. For the families of the victims and the survivors of the Holocaust, these executions provided a measure of closure, though they could never fully erase the pain and trauma that had been endured. The documentary highlights the emotional weight of these executions, both for those who had suffered under the Nazi regime and for the soldiers tasked with carrying out the sentences. While some viewed the executions as a necessary act of justice, others struggled with the moral implications of taking a life, even when that life belonged to a war criminal. The executions were seen by many as a form of justice that was both symbolic and practical. Symbolic in that they demonstrated the international community's commitment to accountability, and practical in that they removed dangerous individuals from society. However, the documentary also explores the complexities and controversies surrounding these post-war executions. Some critics argued that the swift nature of the trials and executions did not allow for a full exploration of the context in which these crimes were committed. Others questioned whether the death penalty was the appropriate punishment, given the scale and nature of the crimes. These debates were part of a broader discussion about the role of justice in the aftermath of atrocity. The documentary does not shy away from these difficult questions, instead using them to illustrate the broader challenges of achieving justice in the wake of such profound evil. The executions, while necessary for many, were also a reminder of the limitations of legal justice in addressing the full scope of the Holocaust's horrors. The post-war executions also had a lasting impact on international law and the development of human rights. The principles established during the Dachau trials and other war crimes tribunals laid the groundwork for the future prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The executions underscored the idea that those who commit such crimes will be held accountable, regardless of their position or the time that has passed since the crimes were committed. This legacy continues to influence international legal standards today, with the International Criminal Court and other tribunals drawing on the precedents set in the aftermath of World War II. As the documentary moves towards its conclusion, it reflects on the enduring legacy of the post-war executions and the broader impact of the Dachau trials. These events not only brought a measure of justice to the victims of the Holocaust, but also helped to establish a framework for how the international community deals with crimes against humanity. The executions were a necessary part of this process, ensuring that those who had committed the most egregious acts of cruelty were held to account. Yet, the documentary also leaves viewers with a poignant reminder that justice, in the face of such overwhelming atrocity, is always incomplete. The pain of the Holocaust endures, and the lessons of these executions remain as relevant today as they were in the immediate aftermath of the war. As the narrative of post-war executions closes, the documentary sets the stage for a broader discussion on the importance of remembering the Holocaust and the role of historical documentation in preventing future atrocities. Chapter 11. Dr. Schilling's Malaria Experiments. Dr. Klaus Schilling's malaria experiments at Dachau stand as one of the most egregious examples of medical cruelty during the Holocaust. These experiments, conducted under the guise of scientific research, were a horrific abuse of power and a violation of every ethical principle in medicine. Dr. Schilling, a renowned scientist before the war, became a willing participant in the Nazi regime's twisted vision of racial purity and scientific advancement at the expense of human lives. The documentary provides a harrowing account of these experiments, which involved the deliberate infection of prisoners with malaria and the subsequent testing of various treatments, many of which were deadly. Schilling's experiments began in 1942 and continued until the camp's liberation in 1945. Over 1,000 prisoners were subjected to these inhumane trials, with more than 300 of them dying as a direct result. The documentary details how Schilling, driven by both ambition and ideology, selected prisoners for his experiments with little regard for their lives. These individuals, already weakened by the brutal conditions of the camp, were subjected to multiple rounds of malaria infection and experimental treatments. The prisoners suffered immensely, enduring high fevers, severe pain, and, in many cases, death. Schilling's experiments were justified by the Nazi regime as necessary for the war effort, particularly in developing treatments for soldiers fighting in malaria-endemic regions. However, the true nature of these experiments was far more sinister. They were part of a broader agenda that dehumanized and exploited prisoners as expendable resources. The documentary explores the psychological and ethical degradation of Dr. Schilling, a man who once held a respected position in the scientific community. Schilling's descent into cruelty is a chilling reminder of how easily scientific pursuits can be corrupted when divorced from morality. His experiments at Dachau were not isolated incidents but were part of a larger pattern of medical experimentation in the concentration camps, where prisoners were used as test subjects in a wide range of brutal and often lethal trials. The documentary underscores the complicity of the medical establishment in the Holocaust, highlighting how many doctors and scientists were willing to set aside their ethical obligations in the name of Nazi ideology. Schilling's actions, along with those of his colleagues, contributed to a legacy of suffering and death that continues to haunt the medical profession to this day. The aftermath of Dr. Schilling's experiments is another focus of the documentary. After the war, Schilling was tried and convicted for his crimes at the Dachau trials. His defense, like many of the Nazi doctors, was that he was simply following orders and conducting legitimate scientific research. However, the evidence presented at his trial painted a different picture, one of a man who had lost his moral compass and become a perpetrator of unspeakable cruelty. Schilling was sentenced to death and was executed in 1946, a fate that many saw as just retribution for the lives he destroyed. The documentary uses Schilling's trial as a lens through which to examine the broader issues of medical ethics and the responsibilities of scientists and doctors to their patients and to humanity as a whole. The legacy of Dr. Schilling's experiments is a dark chapter in the history of medicine. The documentary reflects on the importance of remembering these atrocities as a warning to future generations. The experiments at Dachau, and in other camps, serve as a powerful reminder of the dangers of scientific research that is unmoored from ethical considerations. They highlight the potential for human rights abuses when individuals in positions of power are allowed to operate without accountability. The documentary concludes this chapter by emphasizing the ongoing need for vigilance in protecting the rights and dignity of all people, particularly in the fields of medicine and science, where the potential for harm is significant. As the narrative of Dr. Schilling's experiments concludes, the documentary turns its attention to the broader context of Dachau's legacy, particularly its role in shaping our understanding of human rights and the ethical responsibilities of those in positions of power. Conclusion. As the final moments of the documentary fade, the weight of Dachau's history lingers, a stark reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink when hatred and intolerance go unchecked. Yet, within this darkness, there is also a light, a beacon of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of memory. The story of Dachau is not just a tale of suffering. It is a testament to the strength of those who survived and a call to action for future generations. We are tasked with the responsibility of remembering, of bearing witness to the past, and of ensuring that the horrors of Dachau are never forgotten. As we move forward, we must carry these lessons with us, using them to build a world where justice, dignity, and human rights are upheld for all. Dachau's legacy, etched into the annals of history, will forever serve as a guidepost in this ongoing journey.